Women's Day has become a big deal in India, from social media to radio and TV, and also a lot of publicity material from the government. Everyone's talking and celebrating Women's Day and women's empowerment. Now, the two big images of this emanating from the political establishment today were these. One of the Prime Minister marking the efficacy of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, their flagship scheme introduced when they came into power in 2014, which looked at improving the sex ratio by positive messages and ideas like taking a selfie with your baby girl. And the other image on the other side of the screen is the one of opposition MPs and protesters, Congress MPs, getting into a major demonstration because they say that the Modi government wasn't paying attention to real empowerment. And they say that that real empowerment comes and is possible through 33% of reservation of seats. That is to bring in the women's reservation bill in Parliament. Over the course of the next half hour, we'll be doing a reality check on the state of women in India. Where do we stand? Is it worth celebrating? And what's not working for us? My colleagues Snigdha Basu and Nimisha Jaiswal have gone through the National Family and Health Survey data, which came out at the end of last year, and they also looked at all other available material to look at and talk about where we stand and what do we need to look at. We've also got guests over here who will help us understand that. For example, if you look at the World Economic Forum study on the gender gap in pay, then that's what it shows. It says, and if we can have that graphics up, it says that 66% of women's work in India is unpaid. This is what came out in November last year. They say that the pay parity shows that low wages for working women and that most women were engaged in unpaid housework. They were extremely low participation in the economy and only 17% contribution to India's GDP. And they said, because we'd fallen under even Bangladesh in the gender pay gap, they said health and survival, India was the 4th lowest in the world. Now, if you look at the NFHs, some other bad news that came in is that it showed that there was decline in women working and paying cash in the last 12 months. So we've known that in India, the women in the workforce make up only a quarter or less than a quarter. But the latest data also shows that even in the last 12 months, there's been a decline. So while there are all these efforts going in, you have the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, and a lot of money being spent there, yet why isn't it translating into increased women in the workforce? That's what we are trying to understand over here. And not just that, it's not just women in the workforce. The NFHS survey also shows that women are less and less taking decisions. They're not in the decision-making role. And this is even in a place like Delhi. So it says that it used to be 73.8% in 2015 and 16, and that is down from 84% in 2005 and 2006. So why is that declining happening? Now, NDTV Snigdha Basu will just take you quickly through some of the other aspects. Remember, there are lots of yardsticks in this. We're going to limit ourselves to a few yardsticks to really understand those issues. Snigdha Basu brings you some of the other aspects where we've either stayed stagnant in the past few years or we have declined. Take a look.
It's Women's Day, a day that is supposed to celebrate the empowerment of women, but the report card does not look pretty. Let's look at the states that did pretty badly. Well, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, as well as West Bengal all fare poorly in that category, and they all are at the bottom 5 based on 8 different parameters from health to socio-economic independence. Well, as per the National Family Health Survey 4, which came out in December last year, let's find out how the women are doing. Well, the prevalence of anemia among Indian women has seen little improvement in 10 years, a rather small decline from 55% in 2005-06 to 53% in 2015-16. In fact, high prevalence among women in states of West Bengal, Bihar as well as Haryana. Over to the next point, which is the status of married women in India. Well, roughly 31%, which is 1/3 of the population of women, have experienced spousal abuse. by their husbands. Yes, that's right, physical, sexual or emotional. And 24% have experienced violence just in 12 months preceding that survey, which means between 2015 to 2016. Well, what happens to money matters? What about money for their personal use, their own personal kitty? The percentage of women who have some money of their own that only they can use has actually declined slightly from 45% in 2005-06 to 42% in 2015-16, according to the National Family Health Survey 4. Well, and that's not all. It's actually tough being women friendly when there are so many men around you. Just today, the government launched a sanitary pad, a biodegradable sanitary pad today, and at the launch, there were no women. At the podium, it was all men.
So that's the bad news, but we don't want to talk all about bad news. Let's just look at the goods that came out, or the good stuff that came out in the last 5 years, which have sent out positive messaging. First of all, what we have is the 6 months maternity leave that has been brought in, the legislation that's been brought in by the government, that's been made mandatory. They're trying to push it into, they've said, in the private sector as well. Apart from that, of course, the kind of feel good, they're saying that, you know, you've got women in power positions. So you have Nirmala Sitharaman being, and 2 women in the cabinet core group that are there, Sushma Swaraj and Nirmala Sitharaman. So for the first time, they're saying you have women in the core group of the government. And of course, you saw Haryana's sex ratio going down last year for the first time after a long time. But more on that in just a bit, because some people are raising doubts about the sex ratio figures. I just want to bring in my guests over here. We have in studio Poonam Mathreja, who is the Executive Director of the Population Foundation of India and is someone who speaks very extensively on women's rights. We have Lalita Kumaramangalam, member of the BJP and who used to be the National Commission of Women chairperson. Sushmita Dev, Lok Sabha MP of the Congress, who was protesting in Parliament today, and we saw her in those protest shots, and Ananya Chakraborty, who's a chairperson for child rights in West Bengal. This isn't, of course, about various governments, because as we saw over there, all states, women indices and the figures show that across the country, even in Kerala, Delhi, Bengal, there are lots of factors where women aren't doing well. So it's not about that. It's just to understand what exactly is happening over here. Poonam Mathreja, I pointed out the positives and the negatives as well. First of all, I want to just ask you this prime question, the first thing about this women less in the workforce. Why is that? And now these latest figures also show that even in women working in the cash in hand, how can there be a decline? They can be less, but how can there be a decline despite this concerted effort at positive messaging which the government is focusing on?
See, messaging is very important, but it doesn't lead to real change. We know globally from evidence that behavior change is not easy. Social norms take a long time to change, and slogans cannot do that, and just messaging cannot do that. Well, there's been a decrease in jobs across the country, across the world, and the people who suffer most are women. So it is not that the men aren't suffering, but when there is a crunch for any supply of any goods or jobs or services, it's always the women. So there has been a decline.
You know, because if you see 2006 to 2016, if you look at some of the various yardsticks, but 2006 to 2006, I find it amazing that women having money of their own has gone from 45% to 42%. So 3% decline. Instead of seeing a steady increase, we're seeing a 3% decline in that.
You know, when people are talking about lack of employment opportunities, and we're talking about a decrease in employment. You know, even the Planning Commission, when it existed, figures before 2013 showed a huge decline in not just job creation, there is a loss of jobs. It's a jobless growth that we are having in India.
So, Lalita Kumaramangalam, is it just talk then? Is the fact that, you know, the government is sending out, we are seeing a lot of money being spent on the messaging, but aren't people getting it now? Because even this figure of 31% of women being subjected to physical and sexual emotional violence, that is also from the NFHS survey. Why is this happening? Why are the figures not improving, and why are we falling behind our neighbors?
Let me put one thing into perspective. Now, while there is an increase in the reporting, or ostensibly just in the amount of violence being perpetrated against women, empowerment is not merely about jobs and violence. I would say in this scenario, both are equally important. We have a huge number of women who have entered the workforce, but not the formal workforce. In India, the majority of women still belong to the informal workforce, whose contribution to GDP is never accounted for, primarily because for one reason they own no assets, and also because they sort of their work is sort of slipped under the scanner. I'm not talking about how homemakers or our maid servants, etc. You just take agriculture, fisheries, the entire agriculture sector.
May I
82% of the work today is done by women, but because only 8% own assets, we don't know that they are working.
Now the thing
violence, on the other hand, yes, I don't know if it's increased or reporting has increased.
Yeah, you know, one of those really worrying data.
Make this clear that, you know, empowerment is a very slow and a very tedious and a long process. It cannot take place in 5 years or 10 years.
Okay, can't take place in 5 years or 10 years. Of course, one understands that.
But we're talking about India today for a very long time. It'll take at least 20 years for us to throw off some of those shackles and really show statistical improvement.
The fact that married women in the workforce is down from 43% to 31% is huge in the last 10 years.
If you look at real numbers, yes, absolutely.
So what is there? The fact,
yes, it is.
Do you expect, Lalita Kumara Mangalam, the fact that your government brought in the, compulsory 6-month increase the maternity leave, that should make a difference to this? And stop the decline?
Act. No, what really needs to be done is to retain women in the workforce. If you look at the statistics, it's between the age of about 28, 32 to 40 that most women drop out of the formal workplace. That's when they start having children. One of the reasons for increasing the amount of leave given, maternity leave given, is to ensure that they come back and they're able to come back. Otherwise, women cannot really look after their babies once they're born. The newborns, apart from the question of breastfeeding, newborns need a lot more care and attention than children who are even slightly older. Now, the fact is that what India really needs is a creche policy, regardless of which sector of women will work in, formal or informal. This is in the pipeline, but since we have such different populations of women working, categories, communities, populations, etc., and in different parts of the country, it's taking a little while to plan it out.
Okay.
But the main thing is that women in India, and it's not just India, but like I said, we're talking about India, the facilitation that they should get to remain in the workforce is lacking, and this is across the board.
The creche one is really important. Just recently, I think this session onward, they're starting the creche in Parliament, although that's perhaps one of the places that needs is less. And also Supreme Court just recently got it. Now, Sushmita Dev, there's one figure which I especially want to get to you. Now, in the gender gap survey which was done by the World Economic Forum, they said in the representation, in the political representation, India was still okay. And perhaps this parliament is seeing the highest number of women representation that we've seen. It's 10%. So in 2009, it was 58. It's now gone up to 62 women MPs. You are, of course, the Congress is saying that this is the time to bring in the women's reservation bill. What changes can you tell all of us that you anticipate all of that bill to bring into our lives, all of our lives?
See, whether we like it or not,
ask me the question?
we cannot just say, we cannot relegate the point of women's reservation to 49% of the population is women, so we want 33% in parliament. It's not just that, it's much more than that, because women bring some value to governance. Having more women in governance gives us different kind of policies. That's the part which many of us fail to understand. For instance, you were talking about the Maternity Benefit Act. Okay? Now, in that you have 24, 25, 26 weeks of leave on a private sector, but is not backed by any kind of government funding. So actually a young girl who's 23, 24, who's yet to have children or has just had one, actually becomes unattractive to an employer. So if you have women, more women bureaucrats, if you have more women ministers, if you have more women parliamentarians, I believe that you'll see more gender sensitive policy making which are pragmatic and practical. That's important. Because see, now if there's no reservation, I am fighting an election against, you know, muscle power, money power, like Bahubali, like they say, and he wins, so he goes to parliament. But if there's reservation and one woman fights against the other woman,
yes,
irrespective of Congress or BJP, a woman makes it to parliament. So the style of governance, the quality of governance when it comes to gender sensitivity will change if there are more women in parliament. I strongly believe that.
You strongly believe that. I have to ask Ananya Chakraborty, one of the things, you know, right now Sushmita Sen was talking about seeing more women there, and of course we are seeing women in positions of power increasingly. Is it happening quick enough? Of course not. Ananya Chakraborty, one of the things that Bengal government has been praised for is the Konyashi scheme, among others, and yet when you look at Bengal still figures in the lower ones when you look at the NFHS ones, in some of the indices over there. Why do you think that it's very hard to beat some of these yardsticks and to improve it? Like, for example, we were talking about the anemia one. There's been a complete, you know, they're not being able to decrease the number of women who suffer from anemia. 50% of the women in India suffer from anemia. Why is this so difficult to fight against?
Yeah, because, you know, anemia of course is related to malnutrition, and as we all know that there is this deep rooted bias against the girl child. So when the girl child is brought up, she is not given the kind of food that the male child is given, for example. And even after she gets married, when she becomes pregnant, she is not really taken care of. And it's not, I would say it's not a state specific problem.
Yeah.
I think it's a very universal problem. And women themselves are made to feel guilty if they eat well. You know, I mean, so I think this is something which, there are many layers to it. It's not just anemia, there are many layers to it. It lends itself, this complexity lends itself on many layers.
Yeah.
In terms of education, in terms of property rights, in terms of seeking legal help or police help in case of domestic violence, and so on and so forth. At every stage, the woman is made to feel guilty if she wants to lead a good life.